What's going on, everyone, and welcome to Method in the Madness. This is the podcast that not only delves deep into design and creativity, but also leadership, productivity, and personal development. And we are at episode 8. And in this episode, I get to sit down with Vibha Bamba, design lead at Airbnb. And Vibha was in town for the Design It and Build It conference in Edinburgh and has very kindly come on the show despite her jet lag after a massively long flight. And it was an absolute pleasure to have her on. While Vibha works at Airbnb currently, she's also previously worked at companies such as Yahoo and Wikipedia. So, as you can imagine, designer to designer, we had plenty of interesting things to talk about, such as her journey into design, because Vibha actually studied engineering and got a degree in that, and however, she has now switched over to digital design. We talk about what her role actually entails as design lead at Airbnb, as well as the design culture at Airbnb, which maybe unsurprisingly sounds absolutely awesome, by the way. We discussed the culture of design, has how it's differed between her different job posts at Yahoo, Wikipedia, and now Airbnb, and kind of what lessons she's learned from each of those job roles. We also talk about how Airbnb foster a culture where anyone can really bring a project to the table that they're passionate about. And then Vibha tells us about some of the ones that she has brought to the table personally and how's that kind of improved the overall user experience at Airbnb and kind of gives us a couple of examples as well, which is super interesting. She was an absolute pleasure to talk to. I had tons of questions for her, as you can imagine, and she was, so patient and really glad that she came on the show. So, without much further ado, please welcome Vibha Bamba to Method in the Madness. Vibha, thank you very much for coming on the show. I am going to be honest, I did a bit of obviously research before you came on the show and going through like the Airbnb blog. I came across a word that I have never seen or heard of in my entire life, which was related to yourself. But apparently, you are a pluviophile.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. A pluviophile is
Yeah.
an actual word. I didn't make it up. It is a person who experiences indescribable joy because of overcast skies and rain.
And now you're in Scotland, so you'll be more than welcome here.
Yes.
So now I know why you've come here. I've never heard of that word before, but
There's only 50 of us on the planet.
perfect. Anyway, sorry. Uh, you have previously worked for companies like Yahoo and Wikipedia, but you are currently a design lead at Airbnb.
That's right.
However, could you tell us a bit about how you found your start in the design industry?
Yeah. So I actually have a little bit of an unusual background. I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and the whole
Mm,
time when I was in this program, I realized that I wanted to be doing things that were more connected to people. And I
right.
sort of got the technical bits. I was like, I can figure this out if I need to, but I'm more interested in um, thinking about solutions or products that are closer to what people experience.
Cool.
And so I decided to make a switch to design. And unfortunately, at the time, there weren't that many design programs in India. And there was generally like low level of awareness about design.
Mm.
And so I applied to a bunch of programs around the world, took some time to sort of prepare for a transition. And then after a grueling 2 years of studying design at the Tisch School of Arts in New York, I
Oh, wow.
joined Yahoo Labs and then
Cool.
Wikipedia, and then I'm finally now at Airbnb.
So certainly landed in a good spot then.
Yes.
Yeah. um, could you tell us a bit about that transition then from, designing kind of physical products and engineering them, things like, I know you've designed things like alarm clocks and all this kind of stuff, to digital experiences like websites and apps, because that is quite a switch.
Yeah. I'll say that part of it was kind of the design program I went to. The school I started in New York was a little bit kind of an avant-garde program where it was a lot of the briefs that were given to us in classes were, imagine an experience and then bring it to life. And it could be for anybody, it could be for kids or older people, etc. And also, we had a lot of sort of like room to play with, tons of labs, electronic sketching platforms. And so it was, I think at the time, it was more fun to think of like physical products and
Yeah.
experiences. But I think as you start to get out of college, unless you seriously pursue industrial design as a specialization, there's not as many jobs in the industry for industrial
Mm.
designers. And so and that's not to say that like, one shouldn't do it, but it's it's kind of the thing that's like insanely beautiful and requires a tremendous amount of drive and craft.
Yeah.
And for me, coming out of school, I was also interested in having a lot of people use the designs I was making. I was
Right.
sort of fascinated by the idea of the scale that the internet was starting to reach, and you know not being restricted to like sort of one person using something you've designed or made, but like millions of people experiencing that. And so I think for me, there was sort of this moment where I was like, I can either like make beautiful physical objects that you can touch and feel,
Yeah.
or I can go this other route where I can influence a lot of people and help them, accomplish tasks online. And I sort of felt like maybe I'll come back to industrial design at some point in my career, but like
Yeah.
right now I want to do.
Well, you've still got the knowledge and experience there, should you ever want to draw on it at any time. But
Yeah, yeah. I think it takes it takes a lot of like continuous sort of practice. It's a real craft, and so
yeah.
I'm gonna have to do some catching up.
Talking about designing things for millions of people, then you work in the host success team at Airbnb. And for those who don't know, what does host success cover at Airbnb?
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit broader.
Yeah, go for it.
Airbnb is this business of staying in a stranger's home, and so really what we do is broadly every problem at Airbnb can be described as designing trust between strangers and doing that at scale.
Yeah.
And so a lot of some of our internally the company is divided into uh, teams that focus on like both host success and guest success, because it's not about one or the other. The whole system only works when there's underlying trust between all three sort of agents: the host, the guest, and of course Airbnb is a brand.
Of course, yeah.
And Also with so specifically with host success, the kinds of things that we focus on are how do we bring sort of innate hospitality out in a host. How do we support them all the way from considering uh, offering their place on the platform, through like getting through the listing, taking photos, setting it up, being sort of earnest in how they present it, thinking about everything a guest might need preemptively, providing all of that, being prompt in terms of cleanliness, accuracy, communication,
Sure.
providing amenities. And then there are some like more complex things like communication and, last but not least, how to like receive sort of feedback and continue improving on being a good host. And so under that gamut, there are like tons and tons of like
Yeah.
problems and
It's a very
projects
broad
that we solve.
subject.
Yeah.
And uh, could you just describe a little bit more about like your role there, like and what it kind of means to be a lead experience designer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like being a lead is sort of self-explanatory. At a lot of organization, it means like providing a vision for your team, providing a vision for like products and projects. But one of the things that's I think maybe a little bit more of a standout at Airbnb is that uh, leads are sort of trusted for their instinct and their craft and their ability to push things, and often it means being a force for doing things better.
Okay.
Sometimes that means, bringing a problem that the organization isn't entirely aware of or thinking about. Sometimes it means entirely reframing a problem and bringing the organization with you.
Cool.
But it almost always comes down to sort of like acknowledging the gaps and pushing and finding a way to do things better.
Awesome. And like, what's the kind of setup? Like, how many designers do you have in your team, for instance?
Um, so we're sort of one of the biggest small startups now, and there are quite a few. There are quite a few designers at Airbnb.
Hmm.
We're sort of split up into people who have like a focus on animation or visual design or accessibility.
All
Uh,
right. So it's split that way.
in some cases,
Yeah.
and then of course, like in terms of business units, there's usually like a design lead, and if you're lucky, you have a few more designers to help you out.
Yeah.
But in a lot of cases, it might just be you sort of covering both like the long term vision and the direction of the team, as well as like all of the day to day work.
All right. Cool. I mean, I've never worked for a design team that large before. So does it sometimes feel hard to kind of, I don't know, like make your mark and feel valued in such a huge team or anything like that? Or do you, because you're a lead and you're in charge of the vision of that bit, do you feel like you kind of accomplish that?
That's a great question. I'd say a bit of both. I feel like Airbnb is one of those places where it's a design led culture. And
Yeah.
so, with great power comes great
Yeah.
responsibility. A lot of things begin and end with design. And so, like, every problem is your problem.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, every day you have the permission to go out and do great things, but that means also every day you have to go out and do great
Yeah,
things.
yeah. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword.
It's very much a double-edged sword, and you're also sort of, I think, especially as a lead or a senior designer, you're sort of expected to prove out your instinct, your craft, and your ability to push things.
Yeah, so you are kind of given the freedom, but like you say, like with that, you need to put your money where your mouth is as well and kind of actually walk your talk as
Yeah.
well. Do you have an example, like any kind of cool or specific examples of a time where you had a particular design challenge that you get stuck on at Airbnb and you think you found like a good kind of user experience solution?
Um, yeah, there have been a couple of projects like that. Well, I'm gonna rephrase your question a little bit.
Go for it, yeah.
um, so I think instead, it's more like we sort of attach ourselves to not to design solutions, but to the problems, the underlying problem that we're trying to solve.
Cool.
And those sort of become very attractive, even way past you working on the project or your initial solutions. You tend to continue thinking about them quite a bit. So one example of something like this is we've had, you know, there are Airbnbs all over the world, and there are
Sure.
people from like different countries traveling to like cultures and urban landscapes that they've never been in before. And so I personally, in my first few days at Airbnb, was very taken up with this problem of um, the first moment in the physical world, when the brand comes to life,
Yeah.
which means you get off the airport, you're really tired, you've been traveling for like many hours by bus or train or plane, and you're you're getting to this moment of truth about like getting into the Airbnb.
Yeah.
And that problem fascinated me for a long time, and frankly it bothered me, and I was like, "Oh, why haven't we figured this out?" Because the way we think about it is that the digital listing is sort of like an extension of the home. And so we do a lot of work on the digital platform. But I found this gap where there's this real anxiety and uncertainty about like, how am I going to get into this house? It was like sort of just left to the very last minute messaging between the host and the guest.
Yeah.
And frankly, I just thought that created a lot of anxiety for our guests.
Mm.
So I sort of rallied the organization around this problem, and I was like, we have to figure out a way to sort of solve this. It's really important for our brand. We want our guests to feel secure 7 days before their trip. They should actually have a really good idea about how they're going to get into their Airbnb. It shouldn't be something that you have to like deal
Think
with
about.
when you're, flaky phone connection. You can't read the signs in a new
Yeah.
country. You have no idea how to talk to cabs or
Yeah.
buses. Uh, so
Even just mentioning those things makes you feel anxious.
yes,
Like
exactly.
trying to read a foreign sign that's not even in anything that resembles English or something like that,
Yeah,
But
exactly. And I think I got to a point where I was like, I finished the previous project I was working on, and I was like, there is absolutely nothing else I'm working on next. I'm going to solve this problem. And I think I was like, I probably did a decent job at bringing the organization along with me because everyone was supportive with us sort of taking this on as a project. And it has a great deal of sort of ambiguity to it, right? Because it's not, how do we get a host to think, uh, put them in the guest's mindset and think about creating a simple sequential idea of getting from their airport all the way inside the door,
yeah,
right? And it like there's so much variance based on like cultures and regions, etc. What's the best place to start? Where do these instructions stop? And things like that.
yeah,
And so, we to cut a long story short, I think the important part of that project was sort of getting the organization to pay attention to the problem and getting buy-in to say let's prioritize this and let's fix it.
sure.
And then of course the eventual solution ended up being this super simple sort of like visual kind of check-in guide that hosts could make using an interface we put together.
Mm,
And they basically just took like step-by-step photos of like starting from the street outside their house to the door to next like the keys, whether they're under a flower pot or a lockbox, or if
yeah,
someone's gonna, or the keys are at a pub down the road,
yeah.
and then whatever codes, etc., and then finally getting in. So it ended up being pretty contained, but we
But all the
feel,
variables involved in that, though, because like country to country, the cultures must change so dramatically.
yeah, 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 it's crazy.
And
And we also didn't want to waste sort of like the host effort in doing things that like maybe Google Maps did better, which
yeah,
are available
sure.
offline. And so we focus their energy on just like the immediate like give me a photo so I know, so guest knows to make sure they're in the right place, that they're looking for the right sort of landmark or the right color wall, or like a chimney or something.
Yeah.
And then from there on it's like, what's the outside of your house look like, what does the door look like, how do I retrieve the keys, how do I get in,
Yeah.
sort of. And I think that was a really interesting sort of the process was really interesting for me because I sort of was able to prove to myself that if you care about a problem deeply enough,
Yeah.
you can sort of be that force to bring an entire organization to commit to it, solve it, and really make it better for so many people.
And, is taking it to the organization as something to try and get people to rally around. Is that as simple as gathering a group of people and telling them about it? Or is there a bit of a more involved process that you have to prove why it's important or anything like that?
Um, a bit of both, and a few other things. I think you have to like definitely like be able to tell a really compelling story
Sure.
so people feel the gravity of the problem. Second, you obviously have to collect data to establish that this isn't just anecdotal evidence, it's a real problem that's
Yeah.
affecting our business, by way of us getting so many tickets or so many hosts having low reviews, because really the check-in is the first moment where the host and the guest come together, and if that's
Mm.
unpleasant, the trip is really set up, it starts off on a bad note. And then third, I think also, which I would say is sort of the hardest thing, is these projects normally kick off in a person's mind in the midst of a lot of other real work. And the biggest challenge, I think, is to like not let it slide, to
Right.
keep going sort of when no one's talking about it. It's just you uh, wrangling different people in the company to sort of put the evidence together, tell a story, find the time to do it, and
Yeah.
really not give up, even when some of your initial audience may not be that bought into the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. It must be pretty fascinating to try and coming up with something simple for something that has to cater to so many different audiences, or because like it was, I think it was, I was reading something recently, which I think was about this. And I've always kind of considered like whenever I'm staying in an Airbnb, I'm probably by myself. Like you only just think about your own problems. So for instance, like I don't have any kids. So if you've got this anxiety of traveling, plus you've got kids to look after, plus you've just landed in the country, plus they're tired, and all this like this added weight of anxiety and stress and things like this, like trying to find some random apartment in Thailand is
Ex-
probably stressing you out to the nth degree. So I've never really kind of understood, I suppose, all the complexities involved. But
yeah, yeah.
the solution that you guys have come up with is obviously a very kind of visual one as well, which probably helps. So you're not relying on language as much.
Yeah, we're not relying on language as much. And also I think it's more about like we want to like we always try to build this like sense of familiarity. So because like we want you to belong in a new place that you've never been
Hmm.
to. And so I think one of the ways we feel like is easy to do that is to use a language that goes across cultures, and really photos do that well.
Yeah.
It's hard to forget an image that you've seen of something that of a place that you're going to go to.
Hmm.
um, and it also, I think, helps the host think in a more sort of sequential fashion. We rely less on translations.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I've always kind of, when designing digital products, I've kind of always had this kind of conflict, and it could just be my perception of it. So by all means, call me out if you think that's the case. But it's something that for somebody who works for somebody like Airbnb, humongous company with millions and millions of users, how do you balance trying to listen to what the users want and they're asking for versus trying to come up with something completely new that they're not asking for but you think might help them? Like for instance, like I see there's a difference between like invention and innovation. Like no invention happens in iteration, in my opinion.
Right, right.
uh you know the light bulb didn't come from the iteration of candles, for example.
Right,
Like,
right.
so, and obviously you're collecting this user feedback and data all the time. So how often do you get the chance to come up with something completely brand new to test it out rather than being like a slave to the data, for example, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say there are sort of two channels for the kinds of problems we prioritize at Airbnb. Uh, I think the business and the organization, of course, sort of use the more traditional route of like using data and thinking about, you know, expansion or adding features, etc.
Mm-hmm.
The more sort of, I think, solving problems like the check-in problem or dynamic text on iPhones. Um, I'm trying to think of other things that we've done that are in that vein. Those usually come from like an individual attaching themselves to the pain that a group of users is feeling. And so I would say that both kinds of projects get prioritized. They just come about in very different ways.
Yeah.
And I'd say that supporting data is often required for both, but the ones that are purely a large number of people in our community are feeling this pain usually come from a single person who's like who attaches themselves to that problem and then rallies around
That's cool to
to
know, though.
sort of solve it. We do have a really thriving community area sort of on our website, and so pretty much any problem that you want to learn about, you want to understand how our community thinks about this, there's a way for us to do it and really like filter out uh, comments that are related to that problem. And so that is usually something both projects will do, and it becomes a form of anecdotal evidence
Hmm.
and plays a fairly vital and central role in the storytelling.
Cool. And I suppose how quickly, when obviously getting the user feedback, how quickly, I suppose it'll probably depend on the problem, granted, but how long do you typically collect feedback for before you like act upon it? Like take your new um the photos for kind of getting people to the Airbnb for like the first kind of touch point that you're just describing there. You launch it, you put it out into the wild. How long is it 2 weeks of kind of collecting user feedback before you start making tweaks to it? Like a month, 6 months? Like, is there a typical kind of lead time on that, or is it
Hmm.
dependent?
Um, I think this is a great question that can lead into a whole discussion about how we should be processing user feedback. But in the current day and age, we're sort of divided up, I think, into there are projects that we sort of institutionally have a point of view on, but it's like it's less about the user feedback, and it's like it's not about making a faster horse, it's about making the car. And so
Yeah,
we go at it with like a very clear point of view. And so in those cases, the user feedback is important, but it's not sort of a driver of the project. We spend a long time
cool.
internally coming up with the designs and the point of view. There's tons and tons of reviews. And so when it's launched, the organization and sort of institutionally, we feel very strong about the point of view. And so we look at feedback, but I would say those timelines probably stretch more into like 1 to 2 months.
Right.
Whereas there are other types of projects where the way the community responds to them is much more important. For example, I've been working on we've been working on making travel guides, and that is all about crowdsourced or user generated content.
Sure. Yeah.
And in those cases, we pay a lot more attention to what the community does with the product.
Hmm.
Even I would say like we run pilots that are just about all we're trying to do is how are people using this? What are they doing with it? What are some like vital symptoms that can be used to modify the interface of the product? And so like that's very much a project. Those are projects where we're very married to the user feedback, and it's like
Right.
almost like on a day-to-day basis we would analyze what's coming
Oh,
in.
cool. That's cool. Um, what do you think is a, I suppose, overlooked component of UX design?
This is a great question, and I think it ties back into the thing that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
I think that as interaction designers or UX designers, we've sort of become everyone understands the value of iterations, but iterations are often seen as areas to add new features. Whereas I personally think um, once you launch a product, it's a really nice halfway mark to study human behavior and see like you put this product out into the wild, what are people doing with it? um, and I think that's when great design details happen, when you've done a lot of the foundational work, and it takes a lot of foundational work to launch a product.
Yeah.
You've sort of gotten past that, and while the rest of the organization is looking at metrics or performance, it's really sort of a gold mine period for a designer to look at human behavior and add these really nuanced and beautiful design details to an interface or product that can really only happen through observing user behavior, and really they only happen with time.
Yeah.
And so I think that the sort of tying yourself to the problem and looking at what users are doing with an interface or product you've put out there after a launch is a huge missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And part of it I think is also because it's also because organizations aren't really set up to work this way. It's really up to a designer sort of finding their own time and working with an engineer or a data scientist to look at what's happening post launch in terms of like very specific, what are people doing with it, what kind of feedback is coming in, and then sticking with trying carving a space where they can stick with the project and like fix some of those issues, add some details in, because those phases I think often reveal a lot of like unmet user needs, but we just never get to them because by then we've sort of moved on to the next project,
Yeah.
and we've missed out on some like real opportunity to address uh like the nuanced human behavior needs.
That's kind of like refreshing to hear, just from the sense of you were saying, like the kind of designer needs to care almost past the launch of whatever, because I think it's too easy once you've launched it. You feel like sometimes it's job done and then it's somebody else's job to kind of do the analyzing and kind of reporting, like always working from a brief, but the kind of, I don't know, like company even at the size of Airbnb, it's kind of up to the designer to really care about the problem and kind of want to kind of constantly check in on it and keeps your like driving it, but it probably comes from the culture. Is always a design problem, as you were saying earlier, kind of
Yeah,
where it comes from.
but I think also designers can start to create that culture, whether they're in small organizations or big organizations. Ask for an extra 2 weeks or a few hours,
Mm.
in those weeks to like to engage in a process like this. And I think one story that comes to mind is there's an architect called Christopher Alexander who's written this wonderful book called A Pattern Language. I highly
Okay.
recommend everyone read it. Um, and he talks about this process for designing called the unfolding process. And what he says is that in any given context, ask yourself three things: what is the weakest part that can be healed? What is the strongest part that can be strengthened? And what's the easiest way to get these two things done?
All right.
And so I think
I'm going
that's
to
a
steal
nice
that.
little framework after you've launched a project to go back, disconnect yourself and uh, sort of reflect on the work, both just for yourself and from looking at what people are doing with it,
Yeah.
and apply a little bit of this framework so that you can sort of, carve some space for thoughtful, mindful iteration.
No, that's lovely. Definitely stealing that. Sorry. uh, as we mentioned earlier, you have obviously kind of worked for other companies such as like Yahoo, but Wikipedia is an interesting choice. Why did you decide to join Wikipedia as a designer?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. I think that I got out of design school. I worked at Yahoo for a couple of years, and Yahoo at the time, Yahoo Labs and the few teams I worked on had a large design community. And at the time, everybody wanted to join a Google or a Facebook, and I often found myself asking, why would you want to go to a place that already has a lot of what you have to offer? Why
Yeah,
wouldn't you go someplace that really needs what you have and is hungry for it, and nobody else will go there and give it to them? And sort of in that frame of thinking, Wikipedia was really an interesting one to me because there are tons of, like every website has tons of Wikipedia redesigns, Dribble,
yeah,
etc., these aggregation services. But I was like, why don't these designers want to go and actually work on the real product? There's
yeah.
obviously a good
Do it.
reason
Yeah,
why not, why the product hasn't changed, but it's kind of one of the gardens on the internet. Everybody
yeah,
loves it, everybody uses it, so I felt like I wanted to go and see what I could do with my skills for a space that like everybody really loved on the internet.
yeah,
And I have through the years, I was at Wikipedia for 4 years. It was a fantastic 4 years. I feel like I've learned the most that I have in my life.
okay,
And I always, whenever there are students who are graduating or young designers, I always sort of throw this out as a challenge to them. Like everyone wants to go to the greatest design brands in the world, but
yeah,
why not challenge yourself and go to some place that really you know isn't great at what isn't doesn't have a great community for what you're doing, but it has other types of great communities, and it needs what you have. And sometimes you learn by doing.
yeah,
Sometimes you learn by doing in an environment where nobody gets what you're doing, and then you have to really straighten out your vocabulary, you have to sell your work. But the kind of impact you can have in those places, is it's such a huge step function improvement to the product.
hmm,
Whereas in a lot of other places, you might just have like you may learn from people who are better than you, but for in terms of your own work, you'll just see this very small incremental impact.
yeah. It's kind of interesting because I mean, even outside of the kind of I suppose digital product world and working with clients, there's clients that I've been fortunate enough to work with in the past. I'm not going to name names, but that I've worked with in the past. That if you told me when I was a kid that I'd be working with these brands, you'd be like, "There's no way." However, after working with them, I would never want to work with them again. Like like it's you think they're going to be so fun and creative, but if anything, they're probably more locked down because it's all so set in stone, and there's not that much room, as you're saying. There's not as much you don't have as much to give there, you know?
Right.
So some of the kind of more fun projects that I've gotten to be part of are with clients that I never thought were going to be like that. So like, it kind of goes the world over in design. It's not just for true of kind of Wikipedia, I suppose, but for everyone. But
Yeah, and I think like especially nonprofits are sort of interesting in that realm, that I don't think a lot of nonprofits around the world have really harnessed or leveraged the power of good design.
yeah,
I mean, not that we know that design can necessarily, improve their business, or, but I just think that it hasn't been tried in a big way.
yeah. Like one of the kind of charities that kind of springs to mind is this, like, I've always loved the kind of design work that Charity Water do.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
like they were like the first, like I remember like their first website that kind of came out made such like a big splash, no pun intended. But just because it was, oh, a charity website that actually looks lovely. Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like what a novel concept.
No,
But
I think they really do sort of have, set like a great new benchmark for nonprofits.
yeah.
Although I do have to tell you an interesting story. There is something about, essentially people donate to nonprofits because they think they need the money. There have been some instances when me and some of my colleagues at Wikipedia, when we redesigned the donation banners, which you see at the end of the year on the
Yeah,
website. But it was a humbling experience, because sometimes when we design them and they look better, they actually perform much worse. So,
yeah.
so there's a real
It's
dichotomy,
so
I think,
funny.
with what we're saying. Like, we want to bring design to nonprofits, but there is a little bit of a question of whether it would, like, in
It
the
would
grand
actually
scheme of
help
things,
or not.
help or hurt.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Like, wow.
But I just think, like, I do think that, like, all designers should try to think about, like, parallel fields that, haven't had this up leveling, because
Yeah.
they don't pay any attention to design, and, like,
Or they're
sort of
not
how,
cool or whatever. Like,
yeah,
it's just like, well,
nonprofits, ballots,
tons of
civil
stuff. Yeah.
services, visas. I mean, this is like really a long tail of things that a lot of people in
Mm.
the world use, and they're, you know fairly suboptimal experiences today.
Yeah, precisely. Obviously, kind of like what we're touching on there, the average person that kind of looks at these brands like Yahoo, Wikipedia, and Airbnb, um, you know, even the most kind of layman would be able to kind of see that design is differently interpreted at each, so to speak. Like you can tell that Airbnb design is so integral to their business,
Yeah.
and then maybe Yahoo and Wikipedia like less so, just visually, I suppose, on like first glance, but it's not always the case under skin. Like how
Hmm.
is the culture of design different between the organizations that you've worked at?
Oh my God, so different. I think, and in terms of my own personal journey, I think
Hmm,
Wikipedia was very much a 4-year period in my life where I was trying to bring design to a community and a culture that didn't think it had a lot of merit in it.
oh, yeah.
And so it was a lot of, like, going from 0 to 1, which requires an enormous amount of pushing, not just in terms of building product, but in terms of convincing community and organization of its value.
But sometimes that's the fun or challenge.
That's Yeah, absolutely, that's the fun of the challenge. And you also sort of, I wouldn't say that it was, I feel like I got more than I gave, because
Hmm,
Wikipedia is like an enormously wealthy community in terms of sort of its own principles, and in how seriously they take data privacy,
sure.
or in terms of me learning how user generated content is uh, initiated, nurtured, how you grow communities that value this, that will sustain in this kind of environment.
Yeah.
Um, Airbnb was sort of, I have to say that once I experienced Wikipedia, I also wanted to challenge myself and say, like, how do I go to the opposite spectrum now and see what I can do in an organization that's extremely design led.
Mm,
Um, and Airbnb is like completely, it's the other end of the spectrum where, like I mentioned, design is sort of the beginning and end of everything we do. And part of it has been that, like, I think at Airbnb we encourage sort of every employee to bring what's unique to them. And interestingly enough, for me, I feel like what I brought to a lot of my teams at Airbnb was some sort of the radical transparency and the weight and value of community that I experienced at Wikipedia.
yeah.
So it wasn't so much, it wasn't so much pure design, but just like other ways of like designing products or supporting communities that I feel like um, I brought with me, and I was sort of able to make that part of the Airbnb design culture.
Ah, cool. That's awesome. When I was online doing my research, without sounding too creepy, uh, I came across you on Quora, like answering tons of people's questions about Wikipedia. Is that something you just decided to do yourself? Like, as like I work for these guys, I'm going to answer all the questions that people are asking about the product that I design, or
You know,
where
I
did,
think that when I worked at Wikipedia, there is so uh there's so much sort of like it's such a deep knowledge base of how the Wikipedia world operates
yeah.
that you want to socialize and you want to share and you want to unpack it for the world, because it feels like um everybody's sort of living in ignorance, and there's no reason for that. Like,
Yeah,
I think there were several times when me and the other designers I worked with at Wikipedia proposed sort of building a website where we could just tell certain things to the world, that like it's not about coming up with another redesign, it's about convincing the community and redoing the technology stack that would support this kind of UI.
yeah.
Sometimes it's about, yes, we want to lower the barrier to entry for people to contribute to Wikipedia, but uh, but it's really not as simple as that. We have to sort of educate the world about what kind of content belongs on Wikipedia. It's an encyclopedia, and so stuff that you submit has to be
Precisely, yeah.
notable. It's not sort of your original research or your point of view kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so there was a desire to sort of really show people the practical problems and challenges. And I guess Quora was
Yeah.
one of the ways of putting some of that information out there. It wasn't just me. I feel like a lot of Wikipedia employees are,
That's
some of
cool
them are
though.
top writers in Quora because they answer so many questions.
That's cool though. Um, I suppose like the average person, even simple cases where I'm having to explain, in the very rare occasion, I'm having to explain how a website works to my parents or something like that. And you're talking about CMSs and technology stacks and things like that. The average person doesn't know what goes into a website. So they probably just look at Wikipedia at face value and go, well, why does it look like this? Why can't it look a bit more like, Google or Airbnb or,
Exactly.
and like you're just like, well, it's not as simple as that. Like
Yeah.
you've also got to consider like all the different kind of devices and technologies and accessibility and everything that's involved in all the nuances from perfect ideal scenarios of like latest tech, latest technology, all the way to like oldest browsers in the world, and
Right.
oh god, all these painful things. But I don't think the average person will probably ever appreciate all that stuff. But out of all the things you've had the opportunity to work on, what is some of your most kind of like proudest moments? That could be simply just working at Wikipedia, or that could be like designing the smallest little thing or feature.
Hmm. That is a good question. Um, I'll give you an example of like maybe both.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a few serious things, so maybe these are more like little things that bring joy to my heart. Uh,
Awesome.
so when I was at Wikipedia, we one of one of our like sort of deeper long term challenges was bringing the the evergreen nature of the content alive, like letting readers know that this content like changes pretty much every day.
Mm,
And we also wanted them to understand that like this is made by people just like you. It's edited by volunteers, it's maintained by volunteers. And so this was also the same time that we had worked on a typography update. And so we were a small design team. There was like four of us, and we were not in great standing with the editor community. This is like a community of 5,000 people, and a lot of the changes that you make to the site, you have a lot of sort of discussions on
yeah.
them via like chat forums, etc.
Yeah.
So we were not, just imagine this scenario where
Yeah.
you don't have a lot of social
Yeah. You're not
credibility,
getting invited to the party when
not
there's a.
not much social capital. And along came this idea where I was like, well, and it wasn't to placate the community, it was totally independent. where I wanted readers to understand that this content changes every day. It's evergreen. It's made by people like you. And so what we did on mobile web, which is one of our big like user bases, reader bases. A lot of people read Wikipedia
Yeah.
on their phone, but in a browser. They don't have the app downloaded. So at the bottom of the article, we did this really thin 30, 30 to 40 pixel banner that basically said this article was edited X minutes ago by so and so. And if you clicked on that, um, one part of it took you to the page history, so you could see how often it was edited, and we sort of redesigned it so you could sort of tell uh, see its changing nature more
Okay.
than a dense log. And then the other part of it went to the editor's page, so you could see who this person was, where they're from, and what edits they've made. Now, granted, they didn't use their real name; they had pseudonyms, whatever.
Sure, of course.
But still, we were like, this is a way for us to bring the readers and the editors and like the culture of Wikipedia to life a little bit. And so we thought this wouldn't go well, but it was like one of our most successful experiments, and the community loved it. And so
That's awesome.
it's like one of the things that we launched the fastest. It went from mobile web to web and other places, and it became like one of our like most loved features by the community very quickly. So that still brings joy to my heart
Yeah, no.
when I see it. And the other one was there was also a desire to have more images on Wikipedia, and we wanted a lot of people read Wikipedia for the first paragraph, the first few
Yeah, of
sentences, and we
course.
really wanted to sort of like simplify that. And so we came up with this long term idea of how Wikipedia is full of these blue links,
Sure.
and sometimes you're reading about, I don't know, let's say Cezanne the artist,
Yeah.
right? And you go to his article and the first line says he was uh you know post impressionist painter in so and so century. Now, to really understand who he is, you have to understand what post
Yeah.
impressionist means. And so we find people would click on that blue link, open it up in a new tab, but never actually read it.
That's me.
So we were feeling like people aren't really gathering as much as they could, and so we wanted to solve this problem. So what we did is we created these small like preview cards. So if you hover over the blue link, you got a little card that told you what that word meant,
Okay.
and it had a picture in it. And so I think while this was these visions were sort of connected, where in the short term we were able to help you quickly read something, quickly understand sort of a word that played a role in the grander scheme of understanding a sentence or two.
Yeah.
And then eventually, as our editor community saw that these cards were being used, um, they started to simplify the sentence that appeared in the card. They started to simplify the first sentence because that's what appeared in the card. They started adding images to articles because the image would appear on
Yeah.
that card. And so it's kind of a beautiful project because I feel like we killed two birds
Yeah, but
with
one
one stone. One was very short term, one was very long term, and it's sort of still in the works. But like all the cards are like they're sort of beautiful. It's not the most accessible behavior because it's on hover, but it's probably okay in the context of Wikipedia for
Yeah, of
now.
course. Yeah, that's cool.
So I think those two projects sort of still bring a smile to my face when I use the site.
Yeah, yeah. The reason you're in Edinburgh is because you'll be speaking at Design It, Build It, or Divi. What will you be speaking about this year? Because you've done it before, haven't you?
I have. I was at Designer Builder 2 years ago, and I really liked the conference. So I decided to take a bit of break and come back. I'm sharing some of my work at Airbnb that I've done in the last year, and it's related to like building travel guides through host-generated content from our community. So it's been a challenging ride with lots of lessons, and I think generally, there's rarely a product on the internet that doesn't use user generated content, and so I feel like some of the lessons we've learned are worth sharing.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I've never been, so I'm looking forward to kind of checking it out. But not only are you a talented designer, but judging by your Instagram, you're a very talented calligraphy artist as well. Where did that hobby kind of come from? And it's obviously very, calligraphy is not anywhere close to like digital typography. So like, how has that affected your digital work?
Um, that is a very good question. First of all, I have to correct you and say that I'm not a very good calligrapher. I used to be. If you ask any calligrapher, they practice for like, I would say somewhere like 70 to 80 hours a week. And I am too busy with my digital work and lack the discipline uh, to practice. But I will say that I think uh, maybe Robert Brinkhorst has said this before, but uh, doing calligraphy or drawing letter forms makes you a better type designer and vice versa. Just because I think that you come so close to so close and face to face with the shape of a letter, and when you draw letter forms, you truly understand, bolts and counters and ligatures in a way that you can't just by using an existing typeface.
Yeah.
And the reason I got into calligraphy is because uh, I had a sort of decent handwriting, and I went to a school where there was a big, like, sort of church presence, and there were a lot of like master calligraphers in batches
Oh, cool.
senior to me. And so I would see a lot of their work in school, and I was very sort of inspired by it. It looked beautiful, and I was like, I want to make that.
Yeah.
But it took many years, I think, to kind of get there because there wasn't as much, like training or
Sure. Yeah.
classes available in India. And so I think through the years, I've slowly and steadily seeked out calligraphers, taken tons of lessons, put in many hundreds of hours of practice,
Yeah.
not in the recent past, but before that. I highly recommend, I think for anyone interested in just in typefaces or typography, drawing letters, even if it's not calligraphy.
Yeah. Something I've never done before, but I've always wanted to, like you say, it's like find a class and kind of check it out and just kind of. I might be terrible at it, but practice
I mean,
makes
everyone's terrible at it in the beginning. You got to love it enough to look past sort of the ugliness you create.
Yeah, get that with pretty much any drawing or sketching now. Like I used to actually be really good at drawing when I was in school because you're doing it all the time as part of your like classes and stuff.
Right.
Well, now if I try to do like a still life drawing, it's more Picasso than it is anything else. It's all over the shop. I just kind of scamps. That'll do. um, we're just mentioning this just off air, but I received my first listener question last week, and it is somewhat design focused. So I thought it would be a good podcast for maybe each of us to give an answer for it.
Mm-hmm.
So this question is from 2 seconds. This question is from Ina, sorry, whoever, Ina from Manchester, who has asked, she has asked, I have recently graduated and got my first job as a digital designer, but I am wondering, what do you think would be the most important skill to master earlier in my career rather than later? Do you want to go first or shall I go first?
Why don't you go first?
Cool. For me, in terms of like, I'm not saying it's the most important skill, but just in terms of if you master this earlier, your life as a designer is going to be 10 times better. So, the ability to present or pitch well, I think, or more broadly speaking, your ability to kind of affect those around you when you're telling a story, when you're presenting or trying to tell the story behind your idea. The more I always say to anyone, like the more value you can add than the person next to you, the better you are at removing any element of doubt that is maybe involved in selling your idea to somebody. Like the job of the presenters to remove any element of doubt, I believe. So learn that earlier on, and your career is going to be far easier.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's like a very valuable skill to have.
Yeah. What advice would you probably give to somebody if they're wanting to get a job at Airbnb? What do they look for anything in specifically?
Um, well, why don't I think maybe combining this question with the last listener question,
Yeah, go for it.
I'd say that I think specifically with Airbnb, I think obviously, we look for great discipline in the basic craft of understanding the user problem that you're trying to design for and then coming up with a solution that very clearly addresses that. You'd be surprised, how many people will see we interview that just sort of get
Yeah.
that very basic framework is off just a little bit.
Hmm.
And so I'd say that's first and foremost uh, pretty central to being at Airbnb. I'm sure many other places too. Is that like no very clearly identify the problem you're solving and then make sure that the solution you come up with actually solving that problem head on, uh, aside from doing other things. And then the second thing is, I think, of course, we look for people who we have certain sort of core values, and we look for people and designers who sort of fit in with those core values so that they can be successful in the Airbnb culture.
Yeah.
And a lot of these core values are things like, every frame matters. So we pay a lot of attention to detail with every single frame that the host or the guest or any other person in the community sees
Sure.
via product and otherwise. Sometimes it's things like embrace the adventure, which is, being able to sort of like enjoy working in ambiguity and creating clarity for your team. And there's other values like being a host. Uh, we want to embody what we expect of our community, which is like always being a host to everyone else. You know, respecting them, finding ways to like uplevel them, having good collaboration,
Sure.
and above all, like like thinking of people's needs before they become a real thing.
Awesome. I've just got one last question, which is, do you think of yourself as being creatively satisfied? Or do you think that you always need to be looking for the next thing?
Uh, I think I think we all always have to be sort of looking for the next thing.
Yeah.
I think if you're if you're not feeling sort of some sort of discomfort, then you're not getting better.
Yeah.
And
No, completely agree.
I do think that with the designers around me, I do feel like we're getting better every year. But part of that is like sort of like pushing and challenging ourselves.
Yeah. Awesome.
Can I ask you a question now?
Yeah, you can.
Since you've asked me a lot of
No,
questions.
go for it. Absolutely.
um,
Hopefully, I can answer it.
what's what's a piece of advice that you have for an aging design community?
An aging design community.
Yeah, like a community of designers that has all these skill sets, but you know, I don't know, at some point they may not want to do this their whole life, and they may not have thought about like what they're going to do with themselves and their skill set
Hmm.
after that.
Wow. That is a very good question. I suppose I've never really felt what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. So I suppose I would maybe put myself in this aging design community because the industry moves so fast
Yeah.
that you don't know what's going to be in a relevant skill in a few years' time, never mind 10 years' time. And there's things that I was getting taught in university that I've never used. And then
Hmm.
equally, there's things that I use every day that I wish I knew back then, so to speak. Um, good piece of advice. I always like just in terms of general like life advice. I always just try as long as kind of going back to that thing, as long as you're delivering value, more value than the person next to you. It doesn't matter what you're going to be doing. So, say if you're a sign painter, say if you collect the bins, say if you work at a coffee shop, say if you make sandwiches every day. As long as you do that and you're always striving to be better than the person next to you, you will never have to worry about anything. Like that's all you should really care about, no matter what realm you're in.
Hmm.
Is that difficult? Yeah, it is very difficult to maybe do that. But as long as you're kind of always pushing yourself to do something like that, and also you're enjoying it and you're not just making yourself miserable in the process, because you can easily do that, but obviously there's very high performing individuals who are also very miserable, behind
Right.
the facade of being an entrepreneur or something like that. They've maybe got everything in the world, but they're not actually happy. They maybe have the things like perceived happiness rather than actually like happiness. Like I was discussing this last night with, you know, I was at a Vibha event last night, and afterwards we're talking about it's very easy to look at other people's success. Like I'm sure, you know, for yourself, example, you're a design lead at Airbnb, and for some designers that might be like the mecca of working there, but they've never worked there. So
Right.
like they have no idea what that's actually like.
Right.
So we're discussing Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. And one of the rules is compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not who someone else is today.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like one solid piece of advice that I think you could probably live your life by.
All right.
That was a good question, though. That
Thank
stumped me
you.
for a while. I was getting a bit anxious. It's like I'm going to have to produce the goods, but fingers crossed. But no, I'm
No, that
glad you
was
asked the question, though. Do you have
great
any
piece
other
of
questions?
advice. No, thank you. That was really good.
No, but seriously, thank you very much for coming on the show. I know you're probably jet lagged after landing here earlier, but I've
No, it's
never.
been a real pleasure. Thank you for
I've,
asking so many thoughtful questions.
oh no, thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you speak at Dibby as well, my first Dibby, and it's been kind of great to have you on.
Thank you.
So to wrap up, as per usual, folks, please head over to the website, which is the mitmpodcast.com. That's the mitmpodcast.com, where you can find out more about the show, links to all the different platforms, and you can head over to your favorite platform and hit the subscribe button, and that will make sure that you get notified when the next episode goes up. I'm trying to do them weekly at the moment. Plus, while you're there, leave a review for me. Like always, it lets me know what you think and lets me know that you're enjoying the show, but it also helps bring other people into the show because it looks like a very popular show and people should be listening to it. So, but that's it from us here. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found some method in the madness.